So we usually just jump right into it, and we're here to talk about writing. Specifically, we had talked about writing through trauma, and then that article from the Seattle Times that you shared with me, specifically identifying writing as a potential therapeutic tool, really sparked all of our interests, and it meshed up with what it is that we've been experiencing in our own lives. And for me personally, um, I know writing has helped me a lot to be able to take what it is I'm feeling, thinking, wanting, needing, and putting it in a form where it's digestible or comprehensible to either like a therapist or a spouse, family member, friend, right?
or or yourself.
Myself, straight up. Yeah, that's a big one. I guess that's kind of where it starts, right?
Well, that's certainly where I started. I was in my early 20s. I had married the first guy I dated. I thought he was terrific. My parents thought he was a problem. My parents were right, but it took me a long time to figure that out. And when I started writing, the time I had alone for where we were living was at night after he had passed out in his recliner. And I wrote little snippets of poems. And I thought I was being true to my art because I had always wanted to be a writer. I didn't show him the poetry because he had told me there was only going to be one writer in our family, and he was it. So I hid the poetry away in a strong box where he never saw it, and I never looked at it again until after he died. He died of chronic alcoholism at age 42, a year and a half after I divorced him. He had been in rehab 9 times before I finally said, 9 times in 18 years is enough. I've got to get out. After he died, I went to the strongbox, and it was in the strongbox, along with the birth certificates and marriage licenses, everything else I needed to present to the authorities, was all this poetry. And I was astonished to see, as early as a year after we married, the creative part of me understood that our relationship was doomed when my conscious self wasn't prepared to look at it. And I really think that writing that poetry through the years of that challenging relationship really helped me come to terms with it, not only while I was involved in it, but certainly after the fact. But at the time I was doing that, I was writing strictly for me. I had no idea that the poetry would eventually be published or that anyone else would ever read it.
So it's journaling basically, like in poems form.
Right. I think that's absolutely true. It was journaling, but done in the form of poetry, as opposed to, for one thing, I never thought I could do, I never wrote a diary because I never kept one. My diaries had a very short attention span. I would run out after 2 or 3 days, but
uh,
poetry I could write.
I'm looking at a stack of like handwritten journals over here in shame, and like no, neglected,
One page journals and stuff.
dust. Yeah, just a couple lines. No. If it sounds like from your experience and for me, I know that in moments where I have felt some kind of way about an issue or situation or person or myself, and I choose to write down in those moments after like a couple days of reflection, and I go back and I look at it, it feels like I've been introduced to somebody who's entirely too honest with the situation, and now I'm like, oh, right, like wow, that's who let you into the conversation? Why are you being so blunt about this? And I don't know if I could ever let anybody read this now, yet alone like begin to comprehend what it I just basically told myself about how I'm really feeling. So there's like some like unobjective, unbiased, just here it is piece in there. And as soon as you unlock it and then you go back to revisit it, it's almost like a be careful what you wish for type deal.
I I think that's absolutely on the money. I think that that thing in the top of your head is noticing things all along the way that you didn't notice. I After I started writing fiction, after I started writing poetry, I wasn't allowed in the creative writing class at the university because, as the professor told me, I was a girl. My first husband was allowed in the creative writing program that was closed to me, although he never published anything. So years passed, and I wrote a book called Hour of the Hunter. I I became a teacher. I taught on an Indian reservation for a number of years. So I wrote a book called Hour of the Hunter, and in that book, the the protagonist is a woman who's a teacher on the reservation, but she really wants to be a writer. Like me, she had a husband who was allowed in a creative writing program that was closed to her. He's dead at the beginning of the book. And the crazed killer turns out to be a former professor of creative writing from the University of Arizona. So that was really writerly revenge because the professor got what he deserved. But in the course of writing that, I put in this undercurrent of a homosexual relationship between the creative writing professor and the protagonist's dead husband. Decades after that book was published, I found out that there really had been that kind of a relationship between my first husband and his creative writing professor. So I wrote that in without knowing it. And I don't understand how that works, but it does work. And that's why I think writing is really magic, because your creative self picks up on those things that your conscious self never notices.
Oh, that's all about Hugo.
I was just gonna say, you know, for me, really being introduced to writing for healing purposes or for myself or to get my story out there was introduced to me through conventional therapy and with like CBT and whatnot to recall um certain experiences that I had and then try and pulling out as much detail of that experience as possible. Um, the issue I found with this though is that I had to do the same thing with every doctor that I come in contact with, every new one. So I then had to keep reliving that same story, that same trauma. And so do you think it benefited you more being able to like lock up that writing and leave it be for a while to then come back to it? Or do you think it might have been better for you personally going through it, very similar to my experience into this, where it's constantly reliving of the event, trying to pull more and more detail out of it?
Well, for one thing, my only attempt at real therapy was at the behest of my first husband, who had told someone at a hospital that I was putting out that he thought I had put out a hit on him. And when the therapist expressed that to me, I burst out laughing because I was a single mother, and I said, I'd have to have money to do that. And that sort of cured me of going to therapy forever. So, from my point of view, living through it, writing about it that once, rather than repeating it in front of strangers, is is helpful to me. I'm wrong. I am wrong. I did try therapy one more time. It was in the early 70s. I was still married to my husband. I still hadn't learned my lesson. I had 2 children under the age of 2. I was suffering a serious case of postpartum depression. I was working 60 miles away from home. And that night, after I was selling life insurance, after my appointments, I stopped by a hotel. I swilled down 4 drinks, and then I drove home through 60 miles of logging roads in Western Washington. And I woke up the next morning and I thought, holy crap, if I hadn't made it home, my kids would be stuck with a drunk for a father. I better get help. So I made an appointment with a therapist in Centralia, Washington, and I went to see him. And at that point, I was crying when I would go to appointments, crying all the way to the appointment. I would stop, I would fix my makeup, I would go in, I'd come back out, I'd cry all the way to the next appointment. So I was really in trouble. So I made an appointment with this therapist in Centralia, and I went in and I talked to him, and I told him I had 2 kids under the age of 2. I was crying all the time. I had a drunk for a husband, and he prescribed antidepressants. So I took them. He told me to come back in a week. I went back in a week. And I said, what's wrong with me? And he said, well, there's your husband's alcoholism, of course. But then there's the problem of your women's lib. And I said, what is it? A disease? And he allowed us how it was. I left his office in a towering rage. I flushed his antidepressants down the first fucking toilet I could find. And I was instantly cured. And I think what happened to me is that shock of absolute fury somehow reset the chemicals in my brain. And I haven't been depressed a single day since then. So actually, my second attempt at therapy was totally successful. But I think endlessly repeating it and endlessly reliving it for strangers wouldn't be as helpful as what Ricardo mentioned, which was writing it for himself and having the guy in the back of your brain analyze it for you, because that guy is there and he's listening to everything that goes on and everything you're thinking.
In a way, you kind of do that with your characters, though, because you take experiences that you've had in your life and you introduce them into your stories. There's the professor, that this cruel professor, and then these various individuals that find themselves in your stories from your past. And when I hear the repetitive thing in therapy, it rings true for me, but it's more of constantly having to regurgitate verbally what it is that I told somebody last month, a couple months ago, about my history, either in the war or after the war, or when my marriage broke up, or one of the countless things in my past that's just not pretty. And it turned out that writing it down so that I could just say, here, look, check it out. There. But in the beginning, the exposure therapy part of it, I was within months of having returned back from Iraq, and uh, I was essentially forced to write down through my medical board process and with the VA in-person treatment in their psychiatric unit, various situations and instances, and then we went and we talked about it in the group of people who were sharing this experience with each other. And it was for like 3 weeks, 3.5 weeks. But after that, I didn't go into any more detail extensively with anybody until I started writing about various things in that class that you taught at the U of A.
Well, that class at the U of A was my revenge to the university for not wanting to write regular fiction. I tell stories, and I tell stories that mean something to me. As a 7-year-old child, I was molested by my grandfather, and I never told anybody. Turns out he also molested my 3 sisters, and they never told anybody either. We finally figured it out. But in the first book I wrote, the first published novel, Until Proven Guilty, the killer in that book is a vigilante who's going around targeting molesters who have gotten away with it. So I wrote the book. The book was published. Years passed. I wanted to go to do a school assembly for my birthday present to me was offering to do an assembly for 1,600 students at a local high school. And so I went, and at the end, when they opened it up for questions, the kids in that school, many of them had read that book. One kid stood up and said, "Where did Anne Corley come from?" And it wasn't until years after that book was published and standing in front of those 1,600 kids that I realized Anne Corley was me doing what I had always wanted to do, get revenge on that asshole grandfather of mine. And so once again, while I was paying attention to the story, the back of my mind was paying attention to what happened to that little 7-year-old girl. So again, it's the fiction and real life get woven together in my head in a way I can't explain, but I think it has led to a much healthier person, the person I am today. The person I was when I was out in the backyard of our home in Phoenix, heaving my husband's booze bottle against the wall, that person was a real nutcase.
Well, what you're saying now really reflects to me to the disassociation with PTSD, with the injury of post-trauma. And what you talked about before, also Rico and Robert, and also Omri talks about in his book, that writing in many different times, not only when it happens or right after it or a few months after it, even a few years after it, writing it allows you to enable the conversation with yourself. And when you do that, it's easier for you to mitigate it in any other field you want to do it with the world, either at therapy or actually publishing or just with yourself or spouse or family. teach people how to use this instrument. I know that now in Israel, during the horrific war that is going on, many people go to writing. Many experts refer the survivors to go and write as a tool to utilize in the future, or just to be able to put it on the side for a few moments.
Yes. And what you write down now in the heat of the moment, years later, can give you perspective on that moment that you wouldn't have otherwise.
And in the other way around, with this association, sometimes later on the road, the information come back. And then you write it and you go back to other things you wrote, and it completes things, or clear reality and fiction from our own amazing brain that all the time works on change.
Yes, I agree. And I agree with that totally.
So the disassociation is a big thing. Is when you see it on paper, it's real. Oh shit. For me, and going back, it's like, well, oh man. And sometimes that perspective is a gut punch. Either for the decisions you didn't make, the decisions you were making at the time that were clearly the wrong ones, or the people that you couldn't hear or see or acknowledge the help they were trying to provide. And so it's just a whirlwind of emotions, can be. For me, when I've gone back, especially past relationships that didn't work out, or various other moments in my life where it was memorable, um, and to have those moments is like a touchstone to go back to. And when you have other people who were involved in that, who may be practicing similar things, either journaling, or they've written, or they've been reflecting on events in the past, to then learn about how they saw it and exchange that information, if it's one of those types of deals, um, which not everything is, a lot of it's private, but it even expands further on the understanding of specific events or trying times. I know for me, it's particularly true going back into the conversation of Iraq with people that I served with, who were focused on different things during certain ambushes or particular events, and they didn't see certain things that were going on. But that happens in general just with events. Witness testimony is historically all over the place. But getting those accountings on the record, you could start to glean out some generalities and common truths among the shared experiences. And for me, that's what I would like to see happen more of, especially around the veteran community, clearly, but just with people who have had a rough go of it in general. There's a lot of people ascribing certain things to certain groups or communities, like the veteran community, how we feel, what we believe, what we represent, what's harming us, what's hurting us, what's helping us, what's not, right? Um, and it feels like our voice has kind of been muffled. So I think learning how to use the written word as a tool, a proper tool, could be really beneficial in more ways than just therapeutic. But if it were just therapeutic, that'd be like a huge step in and of itself.
Well, what I have found with my book of poetry is that when I was involved in that situation with my husband, I was I thought I was the only person dumb enough to have ever fallen into that trap. I thought that I was really isolated because when your husband or spouse is falling down drunk, people don't want to be around it. They don't want to see that kind of drama. And so I felt like I was really alone. And the reaction I get to people who read the book of poetry, people who have been in that situation, is that that's what they felt too, that they felt totally isolated, and being able to see what was written down in that book made them realize that they weren't alone. And I think that's the same kind of reaction that will come to the veterans community as what you're doing expands to include more people. So those people who are feeling and the same things you're feeling, that who have had similar experiences, will see that their reaction isn't their reaction alone, that it's a common reaction for a lot of people, and they don't have to deal with it all by themselves.
You're just describing is pretty much what happened to me with the Brie book when I read it. And when I read it, I took the book, I started to read, I couldn't stop. I just went to eat, drink, or do the human needs. And I did it with the book in my hand. And after a few hours, I finished it, and immediately I looked for how to reach him and wrote him what it felt for me. And it's kind of what you're describing. And I did it. It happened after I lecturing for years and doing this processing way for other people. But with this book, your book, Omri, it was so special and tense. I left, I cried, I shivered, I wanted to jump from the place and everything, I felt that you're describing my story in a way, but in your universe. And
Yes.
I want to hear from the both of you, if it's possible, how it's from your side, from the author side.
Well, what it is from the author's side is incredibly rewarding. I was on a book tour. I was in a bookstore, and the lady in the front row said, "After the fire saved my life." Until I read that book, everything that was going on inside the walls of our house was a big secret. And after I read your book, I knew I didn't have to keep that secret anymore. And you can't see the goosebumps on my legs, but there are goosebumps on my legs, and there were goosebumps on my leg when she said that to me in public, because that is so meaningful when you find out something you've written has actually offered a hand to someone else. That's an incredible blessing.
Yeah,
On this side.
yeah, I think I was experiencing the same thing. I mean, when I started writing, I didn't even like if I had a small little thought about if I'm going to publish it or who is going to read it, I knew that it may prevent me from publishing it in the end, and I decided that I don't want to think about it. I'm writing for now my story for myself in the beginning. And at some point, I understood that, like my therapist was asking me a lot of time, but what is your goal? Why are you writing it? Do you want to publish it? Do you want it to be a bestseller? What is your goal? And it took me a while to understand that the only thing I want with this book is to give it to my parents and tell them everything that I don't find the words to tell, that they are afraid to ask, and we just live in this situation that they know that there is something I don't have the courage to tell. And it started to be me telling my story to my parents without removing any detail, without preventing nothing, just putting it out there, my therapy sessions, my relationship with them, and only when like few friends had a chance to read it, then a friend of mine who is also dealing with PTSD called me and told me, listen, I don't want to put pressure on you, but it is your responsibility now to share this story with the world, and you have no idea how many people you are going to help with this book. And for me, it was like it's not possible. And in the end, I passed this thing of telling this story for my parents. That was a huge progress in our communication, and it opens up a huge conversation that we never had with my parents, with my brothers. But then happened this magical thing, and when the book went public, and it was for me like so natural that I stopped even thinking about what people will think, if I want to remove things, if I want to edit it in a different way. And then I started receiving messages like Nahum was sharing. And when someone tells me that by reading my book he discovered that what he has and all the symptoms, he has PTSD, but he never had even the courage to tell it to himself. But after reading it, someone else telling it, he finally understood it. And I was afraid the whole time that people with PTSD will read my book, because I knew that 15 years ago, if someone would hand me a book about PTSD when I was in denial, I was avoiding these things so strong, like any content related to war, to feelings. And like if someone would give me a book about PTSD, wow, no way I will ever open it. And at some point called me someone who is dealing with a really severe condition of PTSD. And I was so afraid that like I've ruined his life. And he didn't want to speak with me. He said we need to meet. And we met him when I was visiting Israel. And the first thing that he told me is, this is the first time that someone is describing in words what I feel. And ever since, this person is just buying books over books and just giving them as giveaways for people around him, because now it's his way of communicating what he feels. And it took me a lot of time to understand how words can influence other, how my story can influence and help other. And it was not even I didn't think that it could happen.
An unintended consequence.
Totally, totally. And in the end, I think that once it is out, for me, the main process was that I could release a lot of the weight that I was carrying on me. The fact that it was a tool for me to kind of to get out of the closet from this. Mm, Only few close friends knew about it, and for me, posting it on Facebook, letting everyone around read about it was, I don't need to hide anymore. And this was something that, with knowing this or feeling this or going through this process of letting go, is something that the biggest jump in improvements in symptoms, in anxiety, in stress that I experienced in recent years happened in this year and a half since I published this book. And this for me was the greatest gift that I could give to myself with this process.
That's something I want to chain another question. Uh, is there things that you think that is too hard to write about for other people to read? Because that's something I had a conversation with someone. I gave him to read some of the things I'm writing, some of my experiences, and some are real, some are nightmare. And he said, why do you want to torture the people who is going to read it? So I thought about it a really long time, and I decided to leave the piece the way it is. And when I publish it just in social media, I'm not just to share a little bit of myself. I got really strong reactions from people, and no one said it's too hard or too rush, and it's a really rough piece for my eyes. So from your experiences of writers and what you talked about, Rico, through therapy, when you're forced to write your stories, is there things that are too hard? Because Omri said, I didn't left nothing
I think
inside, I put everything.
I think it's important to write, especially the things that are too hard, because it's the things that are too hard that are haunting everybody.
There's a lot of shame. There's a lot of shame, though. In my experience, there to admit that you're not mission ready because you're still thinking about the last mission and what you saw, or the mission before that, or the 100 missions before that, whatever it is. There reaches a point, for me, there reached a point where it was just like, whoa. um, the shame of not doing anything outweighed the shame of just maintaining the status quo. And so for reasons that the army couldn't understand, I had to seek help. And when I did that, when I started talking to somebody, I was labeled, I was stigmatized, and I was no longer mission ready or capable or deployable, in other words. And so, dead weight, uh, inert round, whoops. And it's not just the military where you see that. You have parenthood. You have to be the super mom or the super dad or the super student or the super doctor, the super nurse, the super politician, whatever it is. We're not superhuman, and so there no. It feels like nobody's really being truthful for how they really feel, because it's all these expectations we're trying to meet, and nobody's really sure what, some of them started, but they know they have to be adhered to. Social graces and all. um, that shame piece for me has been a big one.
You shouldn't have to pretend to not be human. I think that forcing someone to pretend that they're not human is criminal. That's what I think.
Yeah, but I think in my case, in my book, it became kind of an Israeli story where people are raised and educated that you need to go to combat unit, and it's like it's still mandatory to join the army. And even in my family, my father who fought wars, who got injured, my uncle who lost his leg, it was, these are the stories that I've heard all of my life. And my father, he used to refer to the people who dodge draft, who decide not to go to the military, as cowards, as people that we need to carry on our backs. And when I finished my military service and post-trauma started, I entered into this conflict of something in my body just can't do it anymore. But now it's like my body is betraying what my beliefs, like everything I was raised about. And this is a huge thing that, as you said, to be a super mom, to be so that the super Israeli man is someone who goes, he fight, he come back, unless he lost his leg or his arm, he cannot say anything. He needs to continue fighting.
Needs to put on a happy face.
Exactly, and then continue, and no other excuse. And for me, this was the thing that made it the hardest for me to accept the fact that something is not good. Because when someone talks about someone who got injured in a war, for me, it needs to be like my uncle who lost his leg. Me, I have few nightmares, I cannot sleep. Some nights I afraid of the dark. That's nothing. That's not considered to be injured. I look,
But your
literally, I
soul,
remember.
your soul is injured.
Yes, but it's hard to see. It's hard to see.
What you said
And I
about
have to say, it's more than the soul, because now we know it's also physical.
uh, something you said about your body betraying you really resonated with me. After 18 years, when my husband showed up at my 6-year-old son's t-ball game so drunk that when the game was over, he crawled on his hands and knees from the bleachers back to the car. It was during that walk when I realized I had to get a divorce. So I started that process. And at some point, I was supposed to meet my husband, and we were going to, in a coffee shop, and we were going to discuss the divorce. So I was walking toward the coffee shop from one direction. He was walking toward the coffee shop from the other direction. And my whole body was so glad to see him. My physical reaction was that I still loved him. And I felt that my body was betraying me because I understood that getting away from him was what I had to do for me and for my children. And yet my body still wanted him. And I think that's a similar kind of betrayal to what
Yeah.
you mentioned.
Exactly.
Well, I
Wow,
think
you're talking, yeah.
we're all using the tool of writing to move beyond the detrimental parts of our experiences. And I really salute all of you guys for doing that.
Well, personally, I want to thank you for calling me out as a writing wannabe all those years back, and making sure that I told the line to level up. Writers write, right? That's what they do. If you get up and you write, you're a writer, even if it's just journaling. And so your motivation in the course really has helped me explore my own feelings about certain things, about challenge really my own understanding of things, really, in a lot of ways. Things that I thought I understood or wanted or needed. And just through the course of this decade, um, things look really different from how I imagined they would be in my 30s. But I want to thank you again for taking the time to meet with us. I know you just had a book tour. How'd that go, by the way? Your book tour.
It was wonderful. Blessing of the Lost Girls hit number 15 on the New York Times list. And that book, it usually takes me 6 months to write a book. That book was written beginning to end in 2 months flat. And writing it was a magical experience. And so keep doing the magic of writing for yourselves. And in the process of doing it for yourselves, you're automatically helping others.
Well, that's another. So the book that you just wrote is a book, a series rather, a book in a series, right? About a trauma that doesn't get addressed a lot. The Native American women who are kidnapped and murdered and
Without anybody in officialdom giving a rat's ass. And so I created a task force that does care. And but my personal belief is that a lot of those things that are discounted as somebody just running away or wanting to get away from it, I think most of those cases with even a modicum of investigation could be solved, but nobody in government is held accountable for just ignoring those cases. And so that was the purpose in writing that book. But the inspiration for that book came from someone who was Native American, Lakota. He was the victim of, in real life, he was the victim of a hate crime in the 90s by someone who pushed Native Americans under moving trains. And when James encountered him, he was pushed under a moving train. He was dragged for a mile and a half before the engineer stopped the train. The law enforcement came to the scene. They pronounced him dead, zipped him into a body bag. And that night, it was in the basement of the community hospital. One of the nurses in that hospital knew James. And when her shift was over, she went to the basement to wash his hair. When she unzipped the body bag, his arm came out because he wasn't dead. So he went straight from the morgue to the OR. It took countless surgeries to put him back together. He was a paraplegic. He lost the use of his right arm. He had to learn to read again. He had to learn to speak again. But one of my friends, when he was doing those hospital stays, came to his room and read books to him. And she read my Walker books, which deal with Native Americans. And he loved those books. He recovered enough that he spent 20 years helping disaffected Native American youth in the Portland area, helping them get back on the right path. When shortly before he died in 2021, he called my friend, the one who had read books to him, and said, "Tell your friend to write more Walker books. There aren't enough Indian heroes." And when I wrote Blessing of the Lost Girls, I took James and turned him into an Indian hero.
Wow.
It's beautiful.
Talk about an arc. What a trajectory. That to get to that book, all the places that story went before it started coming out of your fingertips.
Yes, that's right. My husband claims that I have a whirring blender inside my head. leaks out through my fingertips. It's different. By the way, I no longer have fingerprints because in the process of writing 67 books, I no longer have, I could be a crook now because I no longer have.
Forget acid. Just write a couple dozen books.
Just for reference, it took me 5 years to write my one book.
Well, the next ones will come faster.
Yeah, I hope.
You have an equation. What's your? I heard you rattle off an equation, something where you averaged out how many books you've written since you started writing. How many? What is
I
that?
started writing my first published book in March of 1983. It came out in 85. So the book that is due out next October is written. That's book number 67. So if you do the math, I've been writing books at a rate of 1.6 books a year for 40 years. And every book takes a million words.
Wow.
It takes 100,000 words. So I typed a lot of words over the years.
Jesus. That's not even editing and like
That doesn't count editing. That doesn't.
So really it's like 3 books because you write each book you write is like you wrote it twice or 3 times due to the editing, right?
By the time the editing is over, I really hate that book. Yes.
Nice. Yeah, wow. Oof. Yeah, so
But
5 years
so,
to get one book. Omni, that's good. That's really good. I don't have any.
but I say one more thing. This week, I received an email from a man who 6 months ago received a really dire medical prognosis, and the treatments are not working as well as was hoped. In 6 months, he has read 60 of my 66 books. And he said, being in those stories and being out of himself and in somebody else's world has helped him maintain his sanity throughout this 6 months. And the ancient sacred charge of the storyteller is to beguile the time. And my books have beguiled his time. And that means I'm doing my job.
That's what's up. Man, another record that's just man. The journey of the storyteller and the sacred charge of the storyteller. Can you touch on that a little bit? What that's about?
Well, the Tohono O'odham, the desert people, that's the reservation I taught on for 5 years. And their stories are winter telling tales. You're only allowed to tell those stories between the middle of November and the middle of March because you're not supposed to tell those stories after the snakes and lizards are out, because if the snakes and lizards overhear the story, they can bring harm to the storyteller. But so you're sitting around the campfire, around the fire. It wasn't a campfire then. It was the fire. It was where you lived. And you're telling stories and listening to stories to hold the cold and the dark and hunger at bay. And that's what storytellers were supposed to do. Take other people on a journey away from the current hardships and give them something else. And so I didn't know about the winter telling rule until I had broken it, and a parent complained to the principal and got me back on track. But once I learned that rule, I have abided by it, and I don't tell those stories during the wrong months.
That resonates a lot. The cold, that could be a euphemism for the struggles of life, right? And using story to keep those dark, cold moments at bay, right? Or to bring back some little warmth, to remember some little moment or hope.
In my books, I try to remember that in art, it can't be all dark. You have to have you have to have the contrast between light and dark. There have to be things in the book that make you smile. At the end of the book, after Dan Pardee has gone through this awful case where he's managed to solve all those murders just by doing his job, the light at the end of that dark tunnel is going to take his son for a ride on a roller coaster in Disneyland, because you have to have light at the end of the tunnel.
One more thing that reflects to me also is that from what you're saying, it's the same story. If you tell it on the wrong time or in the wrong place, it might bring harm. So you can write, but to tell the story, to share it, you need to be aware of when and how to mitigate it and how to bring the knowledge to the community. It also relates to what Omri said, that he was a little bit afraid to hurt someone with his story or whatever. Like, he explained it better than I am.
You have to be aware of your audience, and or that when you're speaking in a public setting, you have to be conscious of how what you're saying impacts those people who are listening.
I have to admit, when I lecture, I start with, if someone feels that something I say is too hard or whatever for him or her, just raise the hand and I can move on or change, just reflect.
Well, in my experience, the people for whom what you're saying is too hard are probably the people who really need to hear it. When I'm talking about after the fire in public, I talk about the night my first husband died. He died 18 months after I divorced him. He died at age 42 of chronic alcoholism. And when he was in the hospital, my former mother-in-law asked me to come and be there with him. And so on the night he died, I was there. The poem I wrote about it goes like this. We keep a vigil at his midnight bed, his mother and his former wife, grieving for the man we loved and lost. It's harder for his mother than for me. I've already known the sting of loss. She's only now begun to see she cannot win. He's quiet now. A nurse comes in to loosen his restraints, not looking at the women waiting there. She knows. She doesn't want to say. The hours creep by. All stories are expended, yet we need some sound to hold the night at bay. Please sing, his mother asks me, and I do. It is a serenade of love, of songs we knew and treasured through the years, from bawdy barroom ditties to sweet hymns. The hours flow by. I sing a line and wait to see if he will breathe again. He doesn't. It's over. Amen. And the people in the audience who are wiping tears when I recite that poem are the ones who come up afterwards and buy their own copy of After the Fire, because they're the ones who need to hear that ending, which was an ending, but also a reconciliation.
I still see it as a big challenge that I haven't solved yet in reaching these people that I think could really benefit from reading my book. Um, because as I said before, I've been in their place before, and it's still hard for me to, or I think didn't find the best way to approach them that will encourage them to read it, that they will feel safe and ready to do so.
I think the way to make them feel safe, looking at your face. You are, if you'll pardon my saying so, cheerful Charlie. You have a smile, you have an engaging way about you. Whatever experiences you've encountered, those dark experiences haven't detracted from the guy you really are. And I think by standing up in public and saying, here's who I am, here's what I've been through, but here's who I am now, I think that's a way of encouraging people to look at their own experiences and come to terms with them. I think being out in public and talking about those things in an open fashion with that half-assed grin on your face, which is very engaging, by the way, is going to do the it's going to break the ice for those people in a way that will make them want to read and experience what you have.
We can make a broadcast, like a commercial, like they put in the Israeli news. You have no commercials. You have only broadcasts to mitigate the trauma and the events. So we can ask people, if you feel pressure, just read the book, go through it.
Yeah.
You can live through it. You can grow.
And if you read to the parts that are too hard to read, stop for a while and go back to it later. Turn it off.
Yeah. No, I really remember in the beginning that at some point I felt like I'm also putting maybe people a bit of pressure when giving them a copy of my personal story, and it's kind of obligating them. I even remember telling my parents at some point that they should be aware that when, like my dad, that I know that he has friends who are kind of be coping with post-trauma without knowing that they cope with post-trauma. And I told him to just to be aware that when he gives them, being so proud, give them the book of his son, it does put pressure on them to read, and maybe it's not the right time, or like in the end I don't want people to go through pain when they are not ready for it, or they don't want to, they didn't choose this.
I grew up in Bisbee, Arizona. My best friend, Pat, lived a block away, and I was scared to death of her father. He was really grouchy and hard to get along with. I overheard him talking baby talk to their parakeet one time, and I was really astonished. Years after he died, my friend's mother, his wife, Thelma, said that he was a totally different person before he went away to World War II. He was D-Day +1, and he lived through the the name of the battle in Eastern Europe that I can't remember the name of right now. The
Battle of the Bulge.
Battle of the Bulge, yes. And that he came back a totally different person. And I realize now that's what he was dealing with. He was dealing with all those experiences. And the only person he felt free to be himself with was that damn parakeet.
Oh, well, you know, innocent things. Gotta love them.
Yes.
I think a perfect opportunity, and as you can see, we lost Nahum now, and so I think it's probably a good idea maybe for us to start wrapping it up. But I wanted to first, before we did, mention the Tucson Festival of Books and to give them a shout out and to invite you again, Omri. I know we've talked about it. We've sent emails about what it is and when it is. But personally, I think that it would be an awesome venue for you to share your book, talk about your book, and to engage with others about the writing process, what it meant to you, along with other veterans that we're hoping to have there from other countries and parts of the United States. But would you like to say anything about that particular event, Judy? The Tucson Festival of Books, and what it means to you and what it is, and like
Well,
it's an ordeal. Like there's a lot of people that go to this thing.
yes, 100,000 people plus come to the University of Arizona campus that weekend. And there are a series of panels, and then you do book signings afterwards. But there are booths. It's a really exciting thing, but it's a place to get the word out about the importance of writing and storytelling. And I think that's what you are all about. Storytelling as a storytelling in survival mode.
Put that in your survival kit.
Yeah.
Omri, do you have anything else you would like to say before we wrap it up?
No, it was a real pleasure to be here and hear you. And I'd love to participate in the festival as well. And also, I don't know, anything you will need help with, or if you will want to arrange a talk, presentation, workshop, whatever you need, I'd love to participate as well.
Sweet. Well, thank you again, Judy, for your time. I'm gonna hit the stop record button unless there's anything else that you would like to say.
No, I think I need to hit the road too. But thank you. It's been a real honor to be included in this discussion. So thank you.
Yes, ma'am. I look forward to seeing you again in person.
Okay, bye-bye.